Hello, welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Here are the headlines. President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, works the phones to rally support against Russia. The U.S. Pentagon announces an extra $1.1 billion in security assistance to Ukraine. And Georgian opposition protests influx of Russians fleeing mobilization in Russia. It is a beautiful Thursday morning here in Lagos, Nigeria. I want to welcome you especially to the program. Let's begin in Ukraine, of course, with the President Volodymyr Zelensky calling a number of foreign leaders and thanking them for their support as Russia looks ready to annex 4 major regions of the country. President Zelensky spoke to the leaders of Britain, Canada, Germany and Turkey to press demands for more military aid and tougher sanctions on Moscow, following what has been described as a sham of a referendum.
Conversation with the UN Secretary General also touched the fake referendum and Russia's apparent preparation of the ground for an attempt to annex our territory. This brutal violation of UN Charter must be punished. We discussed with Mr. Guterres the implementation of our grain export initiative. We agreed that the initiative must not only be preserved, not only protected from any attempt to disrupt it, but also extended. Ukraine is ready to significantly increase the export of our agricultural products to the countries in need and the relevant cooperation with the United Nations regarding humanitarian issues, and to help countries as Somalia, Ethiopia, and others. I have invited Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau to lead a global effort on demining our land from Russian mines and explosives. As a result of the Russian war, Ukrainian land ranks among the most mine-contaminated in the world. And while the world has similar examples of large-scale contamination, we must step up to what others have not yet done. We must set a precedent for rapid and large-scale mine clearance, for not leaving this problem to address for decades. I am grateful to Canada for its readiness to help us.
President Zelensky will probably be thanking the U.S. government as well, as the Pentagon announces it will contract with industry for $1.1 billion in military aid to Ukraine, including 18 high-mobility artillery rocket systems and other arms to counter drones Russia has been using against Ukrainian troops. The new weapons and equipment being provided under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative are aimed at meeting Kyiv's mid- and long-term needs and could take up to 6 to 24 months to arrive. The Biden administration, which has committed aid worth $17 billion to Ukraine, has been using presidential drawdown authority to send more arms quickly. The latest package includes 18 of the Lockheed Martin-made HIMARS and associated ammunition, which Ukraine has used to target Russian supplies. It also includes 12 Titan systems, which detect, track, and disrupt drones, as Russia has employed Iranian-made drones in the conflict. A senior Pentagon official said that the newly committed HIMARS systems are intended to be a core component of Ukraine's fighting force in the future. Much earlier this year, Ukraine received 16 HIMARS from U.S. military stockpiles and 10 equivalent systems from Western allies, but the new HIMARS will take a few years to deliver. New aid includes 20 multi-mission radars that can track artillery and mortar fire among airborne objects, 2 radars for use with drones, and unspecified tactical communication system, surveillance systems, optics and explosive ordnance disposal equipment. It also includes more than 300 vehicles, including Humvees, trucks and other vehicles to tow and carry arms and equipment. Meanwhile, the European Union has announced a new package of sanctions against Russia that would make them pay for escalating the conflict in Ukraine with what the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, says is a sham of votes in occupied territory. A sanctions package includes further import bans on Russian products expected to deprive Moscow of an additional €7 billion in revenues and more export bans on key technology used for the military, such as aviation items, electronic components, and specific chemical substances, according to von der Leyen. Now, beyond this, the sanctions package will lay the legal basis for an oil price cap and ban EU citizens from sitting on governing bodies of Russian state-owned companies.
Good afternoon. We do not accept the sham referendum and any kind of annexation in Ukraine. And we're determined to make the Kremlin pay for this further escalation. So today, we're together proposing a new package of biting sanctions against Russia. So we propose sweeping new import bans on Russian products. This will keep Russian products out of the European market and deprive Russia of an additional €7 billion in revenues. We're also proposing to extend the list of products that cannot be exported to Russia anymore. The aim is here to deprive the Kremlin's military complex of key technologies. This oil price cap will help reduce Russia's revenues on one hand, and it will keep the global market for energy stable on the other hand. So today, in this package here, we are laying the legal basis for this oil price cap.
Hungarian President Viktor Orban has criticized those sanctions imposed on Russia by the European Union, saying they have backfired and are driving up energy prices instead. President Orban has long been at odds with the EU over some of his policies seen in Brussels as anti-democratic. He has urged a ceasefire to end the war and said the sanctions against Russia are dealing a blow to Europe's economy. Orban, who was re-elected for a fourth consecutive term in April, now faces surging inflation, plunging consumer confidence, and the prospect of a recession next year. He told Parliament recently it was no surprise that governments were falling in Europe, referring to the Italian election on Sunday, following which Giorgia Meloni looks set to lead Italy's most right-wing government since World War II. Orban said his government had revised its long-term energy strategy and aims to overhaul the power system and extend the lifespan of the PAC's nuclear power plant, with a total of 32 big investments planned to be financed using EU funding. The U.S. State Department says America will impose economic costs on Moscow over those referendums held in Russian-occupied territories in Ukraine and will continue to work with allies and partners to bring even more pressure on Russia. White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre said the measures would include penalties on individuals and entities both inside and outside of Russia and support the annexation. Moscow is poised to annex a swathe of Ukraine, releasing what it called vote tallies showing support in 4 partially occupied provinces to join Russia after what Kyiv and the West announces illegal sham referendum held at gunpoint.
The United States will never recognize Russia's attempts to annex parts of Ukraine. Quite the opposite. We will continue to work with allies and partners to bring even more pressure on Russia and the individuals and entities that are helping support its attempted land grab. You can expect additional measures from us in the coming days. Because we've seen this movie before, we know what will come next. We expect Russia to use these sham referenda as a false pretext to attempt to annex Ukraine's territory. But no matter what President Putin and his enablers try to claim, these areas are and will remain part of Ukraine. They have used these very tactics before. Every aspect of this process, based on our information, was pre-staged and orchestrated by the Kremlin weeks, in some cases months ago. We have information indicating that officials plan to announce these predetermined outcomes. In some cases, they even set the target approval rates, the target voter turnout rates.
Georgian opposition party members, political activists and protesters from Ukraine gathered at a crossing of the Russia-Georgia border to protest against Russians' flea mobilization. These are the scenes from probably Tuesday, where the head of the Georgian Interior Ministry said about 10,000 Russians were entering Georgia every day. It's up from 5,000 to 6,000 before President Putin's mobilization announcement, calling up military reservists. But there are also signs that Russian authorities are clamping down on the route. Authorities in the local region of North Ossetia, part of Russia, announced that they were setting up a temporary draft office on the border, and the reservists attempting to leave Russia would be given draft papers on the spot. Russia's North Ossetia Republic, that borders Georgia, imposed restrictions on Wednesday on cars arriving from other parts of the country as an exodus of military-aged men led a queue of over 3,000 vehicles at the region's Verkhny last crossing point into Georgia. North Ossetia's governor says the ban is being introduced after 20,000 people crossed the border in 2 days, with far more remaining in line.
We are here to very clearly demonstrate that we think differently. We are pretty sure that Russia-Georgian border should be closed for Russian citizens. Additionally, we believe that Russian citizens should be deprived of the possibility to register bank accounts in Georgia, to register immovable property, register businesses, and to obtain temporary or permanent residence permits.
We have this action just to say Georgian people, for Georgian government, that all these Russians, they are not tourists. They should be confident that all these guys who come here, it's not a problem for Georgia, because we don't know who they are. Maybe they are Russian agents or Russian militaries and or deserters or some groups, and after some time, these all groups and the Russian government will say that, oh, we have a lot of Russians in Georgia, we want to save them.
More on that mobilization now, as the Ukrainian military claims that in some parts of Russia, the entire male population within a certain age range has been included in the partial mobilization ordered by President Putin. A general staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces says that the so-called partial mobilization measures are ongoing in the Russian Federation and in parts of regions of Ukraine temporarily occupied by Russia. General Staff claimed that there are some cases of parents with many children and men over age 60 being mobilized for military service. And those claims have not been verified, but Russian commentators and some regional officials in Russia have complained that the mobilization is poorly organized and has included the drafting of men specifically exempted from the decree. A general staff also said the lack of readiness to implement mobilization measures was noted at assembly points in the Belgorod and Rostov regions, both of which are close to the Ukrainian border. The Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin says her country is watching very closely after the Nord Stream gas leak. The European Union believes sabotage probably caused the leaks detected on Monday in the Nord Stream pipelines. EU, however, has not named the potential perpetrator of the suspected sabotage or suggested a reason behind it. But Finnish Minister of Interior Krista Mikkonen said Finland will also consider building a fence on part of its 1,300-kilometer border with Russia, with an estimated cost of several hundreds of millions of euros, and the fence will take 3 to 4 years to build.
Pana 22 exercise is an Air Force exercise where the main task or main training objective is to get currencies for the pilots to operate bases like this. The threat from the Russia or the actions from Russia with the cruise missiles and ballistic missiles proves that the concept of dispersed operations is right.
Her Swedish counterpart Magdalena Andersson says gas continues to leak from Nord Stream pipelines in the Baltic at the same rate as when the damage was discovered, but the leakages could start to slow by the weekend.
Vi har svenska uppgifter, men också tagit del av uppgifter.
I want to bring in security expert Temitope Olodo. He joins me now from London. Temitope, thank you for joining me this morning. I hope you've had your morning coffee. Let's begin with what the EU believes Russia. Well, the EU hasn't named anyone behind the leak of the Nord Stream pipelines, but it's pretty clear that they do suspect Russia, and they also think it's sabotage, which further worsens Europe's gas problem. If true, would that be called an act of terrorism?
There's no doubt it is definitely anything that tends to put panic into a population or group of individuals could be viewed as terrorism, and many commentators around the world are more or less looking at this as more of an hybrid warfare targeting vulnerable energy infrastructure. And there's no doubt that Russia will definitely have its day when it comes to punishing Europe for this ongoing war, which they felt they should have won if not for the intervention of the West. And I think that is where we are right now. There's a bit of a game match here, where Russia is trying all its best to try and save face, and Ukraine is more or less winning, and they still have the energy, as we could see from both sides of the fence. Why people are rushing into Ukraine, citizens from around the world who are either Ukrainians or not Ukrainians, to help Ukraine, to fight this bully, as Russia is called. People are running out or exiting Russia in their thousands and even going into hundreds because they don't want to be drafted for a war which they believe is senseless. So, and I think that is the paradox that we're facing now. And we need to find a solution fast because, with some of the pronouncements made by world leaders about the annexation and the sham referendum, as it is being referred to, there is no doubt that Russia will put its feet down, and as they are threatened, any attack on those particular areas, which I said on this platform last week, that might be the calculation of Russia to resolve this issue, because now they could threaten that an attack on those areas which they have annexed is an attack on Russia, and they will use nuclear weapons. And I think that is the point that we're all trying to avoid.
Yeah, and I've heard, a lot of condemnations against Russia for the referendum, which now, according to Russia, signifies that those areas now belong to Russia. And it also changes the dynamics of the war, doesn't it? Because it makes it even more difficult to even help Ukraine, despite the military aids that have been promised. But then again, the dynamic of the war itself is changing, isn't it? Russia also taking out its own anger, its wrath on other countries that are allies to Ukraine. One of them being, of course, this Nord Stream pipeline. I think we read, or we're about to read in a moment, the fact that some European leaders, some European intelligence officers said they did see a ship approaching the Nord Stream pipelines, and they, of course, they can't confirm whether, the presence of the ship caused the explosion that caused the leak, but somehow they all blame Russia. So Russia taking out its own anger on the rest of Ukraine's allies. How do they deal with that? They've announced sanctions already, but here you have Viktor Orban of Hungary claiming that these sanctions don't work and they're instead backfiring on Europe.
We have seen UK's, whether it's related or not, UK's sterling or pounds going deep down. Of course, we have our own challenges here, and Russia seems to be getting stronger. But as we've heard from the European Union, they believe that the cap that they put on the energy prices means that the amount of money going into Russia will reduce, and then there will be stability in the world. But let's not kid ourselves. Russia has said that these are their own infrastructure. Why would they damage it in the first place? We're talking of 745 miles of pipeline going underneath, the ocean into Germany. Russia could easily just turn the tap off, but they need the money, of course. And we know that they need the money. And we know that a lot of countries, are now looking at different alternatives, different energy routes that they could use. And this is why a lot of us in the world are biting our tongue, hoping that countries in Africa like Nigeria, for example, we take advantage of this. This is the opportunity for us to actually become even more wealthier in terms of the amount that we could get in from energy. But unfortunately, it seems as if we're not getting there. But what then happened? Well, we are hoping that we must be able to find a solution to this ongoing challenge, because Russia, one way or the other, might switch off this tap. If the pressure gets stronger, because we know this is the 8th package by the European Union, to try and deal with Russia. And, we even know that Russia has said that other citizens of the world that want to have Russia citizenship can actually come in and fight for them and get this citizenship. So they are also trying to mobilize as many people as they could. But we could see the conflict now, and maybe public opinion will help to resolve this issue, because the public opinion in Russia is changing. It's changing. We know that more than 2,400, anti-war protesters have actually been arrested. And so we know that this is not going away. Russia had to deal with both the internal crisis and both the external confrontation that is coming from the West and other countries, including Israel, which is an ally of Moscow, but now saying that, that scammed or sham referendum will not be accepted. So Russia needs to start reviewing its strategy. But I've always said that the intention of holding that referendum in the first instance is to bring that particular area into Russia, and they dare anybody to attack that area, because both the Americans, the West, will be a bit wary now of attacking that area or going into that area with boots on the ground, because Russia will retaliate in a very, very bad way.
Yeah, the complications are very clear. You mentioned the reservists that Russia has been recruiting, many of them crossing the borders into Georgia, Kazakhstan, and so on. Would you consider, this recruitment by Russia an act of desperation by the president? I mean, it does signify that the war will be longer than expected. We could be looking at probably a few more years.
There's no doubt that the dynamics of the war has changed, and especially with the areas that Ukraine was able to take back from Russia, that actually dealt a blow. We were a few weeks ago talking about the nuclear premises, the nuclear industry that was being shelled, and what Russia should do, how to stop it, Russia being in that place. Nobody's talking about that now. We're talking about Ukraine taking over a lot of their territory which Russia have occupied and beating Russia back. But not only that, Ukraine, with the number of people trained by the UK, the number of billions going into Ukraine, it seems as if those weapons and those training are started to help Ukraine to change the tide or to shift the tide. And if that is the case, that is the reason why Russia has panicked with the mobilization. And we know it's not a full mobilization, as they said, but mobilization is a mobilization. We know one of Russia's best friend and neighbor said, if 50,000 people leave the country, what does it doesn't really matter, because we have millions of people that have not left. The question is, even if 5 or 10 people have a perception of a wrong war, that again means that the mindset of the population is changing, and the president of Russia needs to take that into consideration. Will this war continue? There's no doubt it will continue, except we're able to find a solution. There are times when many of us have said, what do we do next? What is it that Russia, should we leave the Russia-speaking areas, to Russia, and, maybe that would be the solution. But from the look of things, it looks as if even the West have dig down to say, no, we are not going to allow this to happen. Not 1 inch of Ukraine territory will be lost. Because in a few weeks of this war starting, there were people that were saying, Russia-speaking area, Ukraine, let them go, let them go. But now, it seems as if we have a stalemate now in this situation.
It is really grave, isn't it? Thank you so much, Temitope Olodo. Thank you for analysis and, of course, for your explanations on the issues.
Thanks so much for having me.
Still to come on the program. The newly arrived U.S. ambassador to Sudan, the first in 25 years, says a Russian naval base would have consequences on the country. Stay with us. Welcome back to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Here's what's more interesting about the leak on the Nord Stream pipelines. And I think I mentioned it earlier. European officials claiming to have observed on Monday and on Tuesday Russian Navy support ships in the vicinity of the leaks in the pipelines. It's unclear whether the ships had anything to do with those explosions, the sources are claiming, but it's one of the many factors that investigators will be looking into. One of the intelligence officials said Russian submarines were also observed not far from those areas last week. 3 U.S. officials said the U.S. has no thorough explanation yet for what happened. Days after the explosions appear to have caused 3 separate and simultaneous leaks in 2 pipelines on Monday. Russian ships routinely operate in the area, according to one Danish military official, who emphasized the presence of the ships does not necessarily indicate that Russia caused the damage. But the sightings still cast further suspicion on Russia, which has drawn the most attention from both European and U.S. officials as the only actor in the region believed to have both the capability and motivation to deliberately damage the pipelines. And more condemnation now for Russia coming at the IAEA conference in Vienna, Austria this week, again from the United States, also the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in Vienna, Laura Holgate this time. She told a briefing that Moscow had, in her words, brought us to the brink of nuclear catastrophe. On September 16, Ukraine's state nuclear company Energoatom said urgently needed spare parts and diesel fuel had been delivered to Zaporizhia at the atomic power station, which is occupied by Russian troops. In a statement, the company said that at the time, parts would be used to repair damaged power lines and power generating blocks. And both Moscow and Kyiv regularly accuse each other of shelling the facility, which is the largest of its kind in Europe.
Russia's reckless actions in and around Ukraine's nuclear facilities have brought us to the brink of nuclear catastrophe. In the Middle East, Iran and Syria continue to flout legal obligations under their respective safeguards agreements with the IAEA. And in the Indo-Pacific, the People's Republic of China is rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal, and the DPRK recently declared its status as a nuclear weapon state as irreversible. This declaration comes as the DPRK has signaled through its own public statements that it is ready to conduct a 7th explosive nuclear test.
Meanwhile, U.S. officials believe it's unlikely Russian President Vladimir Putin will use a tactical nuclear weapon in his war in Ukraine. The intelligence community is closely watching for any signs that Putin's calculus has changed after the Russian president was widely perceived last week to be escalating his past threats to use nuclear weapons. A threat is certainly elevated compared to earlier in the year, according to multiple sources. The U.S. in recent months has been privately warning Russia not to take such a catastrophic step, but several U.S. defense officials who also say they see no indication at the time of Russia moving nuclear weapons around say they believe it's likely the U.S. could detect movement even of smaller tactical warheads. The U.S. still in the news, though. Its newly appointed U.S. ambassador to Sudan in 25 years has threatened Khartoum with so-called consequences if it follows through on a deal with Moscow for a Russian naval base on the Red Sea. According to the ambassador, all countries have a sovereign right to decide which other countries to partner with, but these choices have consequences, of course. Ambassador John Godfrey told the newspaper in Sudan. The government in Khartoum had signed an agreement with Russia in 2017 to establish a naval facility at Port Sudan on the Red Sea. President Omar al-Bashir has been overthrown in a coup and imprisoned, but Jeffrey warned that the new government warned the new government against proceeding with the deal, saying it would be harmful to Sudan's interests. Under the deal, Russia would build a base capable of hosting nuclear-powered vessels. It would lease the site for 25 years with automatic 10-year extensions unless one of the parties objected. Port Sudan handles about 90% of the country's maritime trade, and a presence there would let Russia keep an eye on the nearby Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Moscow moved to reactivate the agreement in November 2020, but the Sudanese government sought to negotiate in July last year, reportedly after the U.S. offered it a multi-million-dollar aid package. Joining me now is Dr. Michael Ogu of the Department of International Relations and Security Studies at Babcock University. Dr. Ogu, thank you for making time for me this morning.
Hello, Amarachi. Thank you so much for having me.
And I want to begin with, what you think about this warning coming from the U.S. ambassador. His feet are barely on the ground, but here he is with a threat to Sudan about the deal to build a Russian military base in Khartoum along the Red Sea. And let's talk about how that reflects on U.S.-Africa relations.
All right, thank you very much. I'll first like to just make a correction. It's Department of Political Science and Public Administration. So back to the question that you asked. The Cold War, right? Definitely ended in 1990, 1991, but we see that the Cold War has continued in very many ramifications, and this is just one of the other many ways that the Cold War, continues to unfold. All right. So yes, of course, we know that Sudan on the African continent has been one of the very problematic states in terms of conflict, in terms of violence, in terms of poverty, underdevelopment, and all of that. And it appears to me that, of course, the Sudanese government will feel more at ease, to align with socialist states like Russia in things like this, And of course, it is possible that the U.S. doesn't, the U.S. continues to expand and grow their influence, and they are not interested in allowing, Russia or any other state like Russia, socialist-oriented states like Russia, to gain any kind of influence, that would be a competition to their democratic doctrine, So I think that we're not surprised about, the U.S. stance on this naval base in Sudan. And we're not also surprised about Sudan's step, in brokering this deal with Russia. But we're just hoping to see or waiting to see how this plays out, especially with the whole controversy going on with Russian invasion and the role that the West is playing in that. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays. And of course, you mentioned U.S.-Africa relations. Of course, Africa has been a very, very key interest in U.S. foreign policy, but definitely the very many areas or the very many regions of Africa, have different stakes, if I could call it that, in the U.S. foreign policy, and we have not seen so much of a very cordial relationship, between the U.S. and Sudan over the years, and of course this is not also a very good move, to strengthen that relationship. But yes, the U.S. has, very good relationship with other parts of the African continent, but of course we're just hoping to see how this turns out, and I don't think it's going to have any significant negative effect, on U.S.-Africa relationship on the whole, of course, we cannot use the issue or the instance of Sudan, as a justification for the relationship with the U.S. on the African continent in general, right?
But it does put African countries in a corner. I remember, I think it was about a couple of months ago, that another U.S. official, Janet Yellen, also said, there will be consequences for African countries that continue to deal, with countries, not African countries, but countries that continue to deal with Russia. So it does put countries in a difficult corner, doesn't it? Especially countries that, have sovereignty, have democratic processes, and the U.S. stands for these things. They also defend them. So how do you compare that, with what the U.S. stands for, and then what is asking countries to do, especially with the war in Ukraine? Take for Sudan, for instance. This deal was signed in 2017, long before the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yes. I agree that, it has consequences for the states that are in question, all right, or the regions, if you want to call it that, the regions that are in question in this regard. I agree. And of course, this is similar to what played out in the Cold War, where the U.S. had allies, was promoting its own agenda. The USSR at the same time was also promoting its own agenda, and in the contemporary times, Russia stands for the old Soviet Union in its doctrine, in its policies, its foreign policy, and the way it relates with other states, particularly African states. So I agree that, it does put these states in a bad light in relations to their relationship with the United States, and of course, like I said, the US will continue to advance and promote, its interests, democracy, sovereignty, and all of that in many other regions of the world, including Africa. All right. So for these states that continue to form alliance with enemies of the West, they definitely will be in the bad books of the US. All right. And of course, that will mean that the aid that they are used to receiving, or that they would have received, the support that they would have received, and all of these things that perhaps they are dependent on West for, they might not receive as much as they would, or they might not receive at all. So it does put them in a bad light. But I'm just saying that it will not be okay for us to generalize, this. The consequence of these kinds of relationships. And yes, even though this deal was brokered in 2017, it was brokered with Russia, and even though that was not a big deal at the time, but with the way, with the situation that is globally, that is unfolding globally now with Russia and the US and the struggle with Ukraine, it has taken a more prominent, position. And of course, I think the US is now revisiting that thing to say this is our position on this. If you go ahead with this, these are the consequences and all of that. So I'm not so surprised with how the US is responding to it. But I think that countries already, of course, Sudan already would know, what the US position on this all the while would have been. But of course, they have gone further because definitely they have interests also that they have to protect, and perhaps this is the best way for them to pursue this interest at this time.
Yeah, and it does seem that we're walking into the murky waters of morality in this war, and of course neutrality, which is almost impossible. Countries do have to take sides, but if you notice, African countries have been silent, especially in the last 1 month, about what's been going on between Russia and Ukraine. Should they continue to stay out of it, even though, somehow they do occupy a spot in this, because Africa is expecting wheat and some agricultural products from Russia and Ukraine. Thankfully, the Black Sea port is open, and grain is coming into Africa. Some places already experiencing a food crisis because of the war in Ukraine.
Thankfully the grain deal has been brokered, and grain is leaving Ukraine as we speak. But whether Africa should continue to stay silent, the question is, what can Africa do, in this situation? Of course, earlier in the war, we saw some African countries, trying to get involved, to take sides, perhaps, and support, and support Ukraine to condemn, the Russian invasion, but all that has reduced now, and it's not also so surprising, because the question is, You know, if you're coming to a negotiation like this, if you're coming to get involved like this, then you have something to offer, all right? And African states, you know, in the context of what is going on now with Russia and Ukraine, have not you know so much you know to offer in terms of brokering peace, because of I mean you have to have some leverage, you know, on the two parties involved in this warfare before you can broker any kind of negotiations, you know. So it is not surprising that African states are silent, and of course, African states also have their own issues to grapple with, which are almost similar with, you know, if not even more complicated than what is going on in the Russian invasion in Ukraine, you know. So well, while African states are not completely silent, you know, it is understandable the palpable silence that we are experiencing from African states, especially because African states more or less are handicapped in quotes, you know, especially in getting involved in any meaningful way, you know, in this invasion, and that's why it appears that all of the interventions, all of the mobilization, the support that Ukraine is getting, that the condemnation Russia is getting, are coming, you know, mostly from the West and from Europe, you know, and from Asia, you know, some other influential parties in Asia and other parts of the world, and then Africa seems to be more or less, you know, sitting on the fence, you know, in this regard.
Dr. Michael Ogu of the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at Babcock University. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you this morning. Thank you for your analysis.
Thank you so much for having me.
The population of Denmark's easternmost point, the Baltic Sea island of Bornholm, is in no panic and views the leak in the nearby Nord Stream gas pipeline as just another chapter of this international security escalation. That's according to the islander's mayor yesterday. He says it's something people talk about at the same level we talk about the rising energy prices. He was speaking to journalists. His comments came after the European Union said it believed sabotage probably caused the leaks detected on Monday, echoing views aired by Germany, Denmark and Sweden. Denmark's defense minister said in a statement after a meeting with NATO General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg that there was reason to be concerned about the security situation in the region. Still to come on the program. Ukrainians returning to liberated villages by boat. Stay with us. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, you're watching the last lap of our special coverage today. It's 1 hour, actually, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But let's talk some more now about the new EU package of sanctions against Russia. Seeking to deprive Moscow of trade revenue over the conflict in Ukraine, the EU has also proposed banning the import of Russian-made hygiene products, from soap and shaving items to toilet paper and deodorant. The 8th wave of anti-Russian sanctions unveiled in Brussels on Wednesday would also ban the import of several steel products in an attempt to impose a price cap on Russian oil. Now, according to the European Union Commission President, would not accept the sham referenda and any kind of annexation in Ukraine, and were determined to make the Kremlin pay for this further escalation. She also added that the proposed sanctions package is expected to deprive Russia of an additional 7 billion euros in revenues. And that scheme requires EU residents to make do without Russian-made beauty or makeup products, shaving supplies, personal deodorants, dental floss, soap, and toilet paper. I have joining me now Channels Television's business correspondent, Ladi Williams.
Morning.
Keep deliberately remembering it is Williams. So before we go on to talk about, the inflation hits in economies this year, right, especially in Europe, a ban on beauty, makeup products, shaving supplies, personal deodorants, dental floss. How much of that comes from Russia, I wonder?
Well, quite a lot, actually. Most of these products actually come, from Russia. We know Russia actually, they produce most of these products. But, with these sanctions, they're not able to sell, most of these products. And we see how that's impacting their output at this time.
Yeah, it must be really important to European countries for them to focus on a ban on that as well.
Exactly, because that means they actually needed, those products. But at the end of the day, they have to, mount on those sanctions.
I guess you don't know what you have until you begin to miss
Exactly.
it. So back to, of course, the inflation, which is a major topic this year. Major economies being hit in record highs. Russia is beginning to feel the pinch as well.
Yeah, just a little pinch this time. It's more like a week-on-week pinch. But, year on year, we're seeing inflation actually come down in Russia, even though most economies, the major economies in the world, are hitting new record highs, every time we get the data for CPI. But this time it's a week-on-week rise, even though they've had about 11 consecutive, reduction in their CPI rate. And that's been some kind of deflation, happening, the Russian economy. But you might look at it and say, okay, the world is suffering, from inflation, but we're seeing Russia going the other way. But it's these sanctions. It's actually hitting, consumer demand in Russia. And that's why we're actually seeing, kind of deflation happening there at the moment. But the recent data we got there week on week, we're seeing an uptick, with their inflation rate, their CPI reading. And it's coming after the central bank actually hiked, cut rates again, because we know they've been cutting rates, ever since they invaded Ukraine. But cutting rates now is not looking so attractive to them at this point, because now they're seeing that inflation is starting to creep in gradually. So they're hinting, at this time at, actually reducing, the rate cuts, at this time, so that they can actually rein in inflation if it wants to start, rising at this time.
Yeah, but I also see the unemployment rate is also low.
Yeah.
How will that impact on the economy for Russia,
Yeah,
especially
so
now?
yeah, we're seeing unemployment rate actually drop, at this time. But there's supposed to be some kind of inverse relationship between, inflation and unemployment. But this reading is giving us some kind of a mismatch. We're not able to really gauge what's happening with the Russian economy with this data. But at the end of the day, it just shows that, most of what we're seeing is, controlled response, from Russia, trying to, make the economy look strong at this time, even though they're suffering a lot of sanctions, at this time. But with the unemployment rate, coming down, it is quite a good thing. But the next data we're getting will show how much Putin's mobilization,
but that's for the military, though. Yeah. Well, thankfully, someone wants to buy from Russia, and it's interesting that this is the Taliban.
Yeah, the Taliban. Yeah, that's that conversation has been in the works for a while now, but they finally signed, an agreement, for the meantime, But it's not long term, but they're gonna just check it out, see how. It pays both parties at the time, because we know after the Taliban actually took over, Afghanistan, most countries don't recognize, that government, and that has impacted, the people there. They're not able to, trade and, get all those goods they need. But now Russia is going to sign, this deal with them. They're going to be able to supply them gasoline and some other much needed products for the economy. So it's good for, Afghanistan at this point, because they're also trying to diversify their global trading partners. So this is a good step. This is an advantage for them. But we know also Russia is trying to get,
and the people really need it.
More partners at this time.
Yeah, Vladi, thank you so much. And I'm sorry for taking up so much of your time.
No, it's fine.
You're on at 10, I understand. So good luck with that.
Thank you.
Well, very quickly, in sports news, the father of former Everton winger Daniel Bilyatnov claims his son has been called up to fight in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He's just 37 years old. He spent 3 years playing for the Toffees in the Premier League between 2009 and 2012 before retiring from football in 2019. We remember last week, President Vladimir Putin announced a partial mobilization order making military-aged males with armed forces training liable to be drafted. And that order would see as many as 300,000 Russians being called up to serve in the conflict, with queues of cars on the border with Georgia especially heading out of the country to avoid the call.
Unthinkable a few weeks ago.
And as we gradually close the program now, Ukrainian volunteer Vitaly Kivarenko has loaded a small boat, a rowing boat, with tins of food and supplies by the village of Stary Saltiev in the Petriksky Reservoir, northeast of Kharkiv, ready to make a short trip, which was unthinkable, of course, just a few weeks ago, after Ukrainian forces pushed back Russian troops from the eastern banks of the reservoir opposite Stary Saltiev in a counteroffensive earlier this month. Volunteers and relatives can finally reach those in isolated villages on the other side, and some of those who fled are now returning home. Well, the easiest way to get to any of those villages is by boat, of course. Rowing is the easier option to cross the water and deliver flour, sugar, oil and fuel for generators. The bridge, of course, to the village was blasted in two by Ukrainian forces trying to halt the advance of Russian troops just days into the Russian invasion. And that's the program today. Thanks for watching. We'll have an update at 5. I'm Amarachi Ubani.